Imagine for a moment the silence of a city where the pulse has stopped. In our last session, we stood amidst the smoking ruins of Isaiah 13. We watched the operating manual of collapse dismantle an empire piece by piece. We heard the jackals howling in empty palaces where emperors once sat. It was a portrait of absolute desolation, a world where the sun had gone dark and the pride of an era was crushed into the dust. But Isaiah does not leave us in the dark. He does not let the story end with a funeral. The very next breath, the very next verse, begins with a word that changes the trajectory of the universe: mercy. Today, we step into Isaiah 14. We call it the tyrant's grave. It is a sacred architecture mapping the rise, the frantic reach, and the subterranean fall of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. A blueprint drawn centuries before the first brick of Berlin was ever laid. The placement of these chapters is no accident. 13 is the massa, the burden. It is heavy, dark, and focused on the physical shattering of an empire. But 14 is the mashal, the taunt-song. The logic is simple yet profound. You cannot sing the song of the fallen king until the king has actually fallen. Babylon was not merely a city, it was the direct spiritual heir to the Tower of Babel. It represents a civilization built on collective pride and technological power, a system that attempts to replace divine sovereignty with human ego. The king of Babylon repeats the same rebellion as those ancient builders. Genesis records humanity saying, "Let us build a tower to heaven." Isaiah records the tyrant saying, "I will ascend to heaven." The empire of Babylon is simply Babel with an army, a spiritual virus that attaches itself to every empire that seeks to replace the divine with the human. We begin in the shadow of 1945. The smoke of the crematoria is still clearing. Millions of survivors are wandering across a continent that tried to consume them. The prophet opens this chapter with a promise of restoration in verse 1.
For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, and will again choose Israel, and settle them in their own land. And the strangers will be joined with them, and they will cleave to the house of Jacob.
This mercy is the specific divine response to the wrath of the previous chapter. It is the mercy that emerges after the scourge has done its work. Just as a field must be ploughed to be planted, the old world of Europe was ploughed by war so that a new seed could finally be sown in its own soil. The focus here is on the word hinijam, to settle them. This isn't just a physical move, it is the gift of manucha, true rest. After the fever of the diaspora, God is anchoring their souls. The Holocaust was the final brutal proof that the short bed of Europe was no longer a place where a people could find peace. The reversal continues in verse 2.
And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the land of the Lord for male and female servants. And they will take as captives those whose captives they were, and they will rule over their oppressors.
For 2,000 years in Europe, Israel was the ultimate captive. But here, Isaiah describes a total inversion. Think of the Exodus 1947 ship packed with survivors being turned away by empires. Then, look forward just a few months to May 1948, the moment the blue and white flag was raised over the land. The hands that were once shackled in the camps were now the hands raising the standard of a sovereign nation. Think of the rise of the IDF, composed of those with blue numbers still on their arms. The captive had become the captor of his own destiny. Then comes the promise of peace in verse 3.
And it will come to pass in the day that the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear, and from the hard bondage in which you were made to serve.
This rest is a resting place for the soul. In the diaspora, the heart lived in a constant state of fear. Europe was that hard bondage, but in the land a straight mind is found. Once the survivors leave the mental constraints of European logic, they find the sober rest of a nation finally at home in its own skin. Once the survivors have breath in their lungs, they are given a voice. In verse 4,
You will take up this mashal against the king of Babylon and say, How the oppressor has ceased, how the golden city has ceased.
a mashal is a parable. In the years after 1945, the tyrant's name became exactly that, the universal shorthand for evil. Think of the golden cities of Europe, Berlin, Paris, Vienna. They were cities of gold that pretended to be the height of culture, yet they were twisted and cruel. When the return home began, those cities ceased to have power over the soul. The refuge of lies was over. Now, the camera pans to the machinery of evil. Isaiah describes the physical and legal dismantling of a monster, starting in verse 5.
The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers,
And in verse 6,
which struck the peoples in fury with unceasing blows, and in anger subdued nations with relentless persecution.
to stop a tyrant, you must break both the staff, the physical military force, and the scepter, the legal authority. In 1945, the physical staff snapped on the battlefield. Then, the scepter was broken when the Nazi laws were declared extinguished. This captures the unique horror of the Holocaust. It was unceasing. The world begins to breathe again. In verse 7,
The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing.
and then, in verse 8,
Yes, pine trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, Since you are laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us.
in prophetic imagery, rulers and nations are compared to towering trees. A tyrant is a woodcutter. He exists only to fell anything that grows taller than him. When the woodcutter is laid low, the other trees of the forest, the leaders and nations of the world, can finally stand tall again. The rejoicing of the trees is the sound of a world no longer threatened by the axe of imperial appetite. The vision descends into the depths, in verse 9.
Sheol from beneath is excited to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you, even all the chief ones of the earth. It has raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations.
They speak to him, in verse 10.
All of them will speak and say to you, Have you also become as weak as we? Have you become like us?
Now the poem descends. Isaiah uses biting sarcasm. The dead kings rise from thrones of dust. This is the unmasking. At Nuremberg, the leaders appeared as shrunken, ordinary men. Stripped of the uniforms and the theatrical lighting, the myth of the superior man vanished. This weakness is the realization that without golden armies, a tyrant has no inner strength to sustain him in the dark. The final irony of his glory follows, in verse 11.
Your pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread under you as a bed, and worms are your covering.
In life he slept on silk. In the grave, the maggots are the mattress. There is a haunting poetic association here. The Hebrew word for harp is nabal. It sounds almost identical to the word for a rotting carcass, which is nevela. In the ears of history, the music of power, the soundtracks of destiny, became indistinguishable from the stench of decay. The end was a dirt pit outside a bunker, the parasites of death reflecting the parasitic nature of a life lived for self. Then the prophet addresses the falling star in verse 12.
How you have fallen from the heavens, shining one, son of dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who weakened the nations.
This is Hillel ben Shachar, the Shining One, son of the dawn. This refers to the morning star which blazes across the sky just before the sun rises, only to be extinguished by the real light of day. This is the anti-Messiah archetype, someone who mimics divine light. Adolf Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, reflected that the devil didn't look like a monster, he looked like a normal man. Before we read the tyrant's words, notice something remarkable about the structure. Isaiah is drawing a vertical map of the universe. The tyrant moves upward through the entire cosmos. First the stars, the highest lights visible to human eyes, then the Mount of Assembly, the imagined throne of the gods, then the clouds, the ceiling of the world, and finally, heaven itself. It is a climb through every level of creation. The tyrant is not satisfied with ruling nations, he wants to rule the cosmos. But once he reaches the highest point imaginable, the prophet pulls the trap door. The higher the pride climbs, the deeper the fall must go. Listen carefully to the rhythm of the tyrant's voice. 5 times he says, "I will." Each step climbs higher into the heavens. Listen to the ladder of arrogance itself, starting in verse 13.
For you said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north.
And in verse 14,
I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will make myself like the Most High. I will ascend. I will raise my throne. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly. I will ascend above the clouds. I will be like the Most High.
each step builds a ladder to heaven, step by step. 5 declarations of I will. This is the peak. But Isaiah has been building a trap the entire time. The ladder reaches its final rung, and then the floor disappears. In verse 15.
Instead, you are brought down to Sheol, to the uttermost parts of the pit.
Then comes the collapse. One small Hebrew word shatters the illusion. Ah, but. It functions like a trapdoor. In one moment, the 5-step ascent turns into a total plunge. The highest points, heaven, stars, clouds, are replaced by the lowest, Sheol and the pit. It suggests that at the very moment he felt most godlike, the floor fell out. The tyrant tried to climb through the heavens. Isaiah sends him below the earth. Hitler went from aerial propaganda in the clouds to a concrete tomb 50 feet underground in an instant. The world stares at the remains in verse 16.
Those who see you will gaze at you and consider you, saying, Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms?
This is the emotional center. The viewpoint moves from the tyrant's self-image to the world's judgment. Imagine the world looking at the broken body in the dust. The myth collapses. Once the image is unmasked, the empire collapses with it. The world asks a single question. Is this the man? The indictment continues in verse 17.
Who made the world like a wilderness and destroyed its cities? Who never released his prisoners to their homes?
This captures the policy of no return. He turned civilization into a desert. In the concentration camp system, there was no homecoming. Even as the war was lost, they forced captives onto death marches, holding them until the last second of power. Isaiah contrasts his end with other rulers. In verse 18.
All the kings of the nations, every one of them, lie in glory, each in his own house.
But for the tyrant, in verse 19,
But you are cast out of your grave like a rejected branch, clothed with the slain, with those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a trampled carcass.
Isaiah moves to the refuse heap. The tyrant is a rejected branch, a diseased shoot flung away by the gardener. While other kings have tombs, this king's shroud is the piled-up bodies of his own fallen soldiers. In 1945, the leader's remains were burned in a shell crater. The Earth's immune system vomited him out. The verdict is final, in verse 20.
You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land and slain your people. Let the offspring of evildoers never more be named.
This is the ultimate measure-for-measure verdict. He effectively murdered his own people. In March 1945, Hitler issued the Nero Decree to destroy Germany's own infrastructure, because if the people couldn't win, they didn't deserve to survive. Because he disconnected himself from his people, he is disconnected from the dignity of burial. The decree stands. The lineage was systematically uprooted. The name became a curse blotted out from human vocabulary. Then comes the judgment on his legacy, in verse 21.
Prepare a slaughtering block for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers. Let them not rise to inherit the land and cover the face of the world with cities.
A chilling legalism. In the prophetic framework, sons are the ideological inheritors. Yet the literal history is haunting. Hitler died childless. The high-ranking leadership's children were often lost in the chaos of the end. The legacy was blotted out, ensuring the branch would never rise again. This was the silencing of the impure shofar, so that the great shofar of Israel's redemption could finally be heard. The Lord's declaration follows in verse 22.
For I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant, and offspring and posterity, says the Lord.
The Reich vanished instantly because the rising was divine. Contrast this with the survivors. They didn't face oblivion, they faced resurrection. They became the foundation of a sovereign state, while the enemy lineage faced a total end. The physical land is reclaimed. In verse 23.
I will also make it a possession for the porcupine and into swampland, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, says the Lord of hosts.
History sometimes carries out what the prophets describe metaphorically, entire regimes swept away like dust before a broom. In 1945, this divine housekeeping was literal. The land was swept clean of the structures and symbols of the wicked to prepare for a new beginning. And finally, the oath that seals it all in verse 24.
The Lord of hosts has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it shall stand.
The laws that govern history have never changed. Pride rises, power concentrates, violence spreads, nations gather, empires fall. And then the survivors speak. Isaiah 14 proves that the fall of the tyrant is not the end. It is the clearing of the ground for verse 1 to be fulfilled. Think back to where we began today with that single word, mercy. We have travelled through the bunker, the pit and the refuse heap of history, only to find ourselves back at the beginning. The collapse of the Golden City was not just a punishment, it was a rescue. It was the removal of the stone from the mouth of the well so that the people of Jacob could finally drink. We have seen the woodcutter laid low, and now, as the prophet told us in verse 7, the result is unmistakable. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. And now, finally, they break forth into singing. The shadow has passed, the shining one has fallen, and a nation has been reborn in the light of its own dawn. Thank you for listening.